Hey, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie, hope you're having an amazing day. You see what happens when you subscribe. You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. On this episode, we talked to Gary Ballesteros. He's been in the compliance game for a while. He built a really, really cool program. The first ombudsman program, the first speak up program in the world came from his company. And he really just has a lot of really cool stories and a lot of really cool frameworks for how to be more effective and communicate with the business what's in bounds and what's out of bounds. I think you're really going to enjoy it.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
So welcome to the Ethics Experts. Real excited to have you on today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So let's just dive right in. I'd love to hear a little bit about your story on how you got into this game. Everybody seems to have a winding path on how they got into this game.
Right. Well, I have been with Rockwell Automation for almost 30 years. And in fact, even when I was in private practice at Jenner & Block in Chicago, Rockwell was one of our clients. So even before joining Rockwell for almost 30 years, I was doing years of work, handling some of their matters as an outside counsel. So I start there because I've got this long history with the company, going way back to probably 1990. But it was probably around the year 2000 or so that we got a new general counsel. And one of the first things he identified was, we don't have anyone in the legal team who's specifically dedicated to compliance. And that seems to be a weakness in the way we're structured. And so I want to create a new compliance office. Was thrown open for anybody who was interested. I threw my hat in the ring. I got selected and was kind of off to the races.
Why'd you throw your hat in the ring? Why did you
applied for the job internally at Rockwell.
Yeah, but why? What attracted you to that?
Yeah. Well, I had a background in sort of regulatory issues. I had started my career as an environmental lawyer and in doing environmental litigation. And I had largely guided Rockwell's environmental health and safety programs in my initial years. So the way we were structured back then is I called them compliance islands. And some of them were maybe even compliance archipelagos, little groups, subsets of subject matter experts who handled trade compliance, who handled environmental health and safety, who looked after our SEC filings, or handled labor and employment law, but they all acted sort of independently. And what we lacked was a coherent strategy and cohesiveness around how we manage those functions. And so as the leader of one of those silos, I was interested in kind of taking it to a higher level and thinking about the interconnectedness and, how could we manage that function in a more cohesive way? So that's what kind of attracted me to it.
And what was the cost of the lack of cohesiveness? What was the cost of the archipelago-ness of all these little sort of like independent compliance operations? Why was it important to bring all those guys together and overlay that sort of, as you called it, a cohesive or a coherent strategy?
Yeah. I think the simple answer to that, Nick, is it's the same cost that you see anytime you have overly siloed functionality. And that is, you end up with a lot of repeat or duplicative types of activities.
Right.
So let's take training, for example. I feel like you can't run a compliance function and expect employees to follow the rules if you don't teach them what the rules are. So training and communication is a very important part of running a compliance organization. So when you have these siloed organizations, we had EHS training that sat on this platform, and then we ran general ethics training on a different platform with a different sort of look and feel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you talk about the cost, It's just, well, why are you doing things 7 different ways when really there might be a way to get a one-stop shop, have a consistent platform, a consistent message, consistent vendor. And then, if you're literally talking about cost as in dollars and cents, yeah, you're going to drive some cost savings there. I think you're more efficient, you're more effective if it's cohesive.
Yeah, I think you're right, and this might be a stupid question, but buckle up because we got an hour, so you're going to hear a lot of these. But do you feel like the focus? So I kind of have this theory of like program progression, where like when a program first starts, or when our industry first started, it was really all about pain avoidance. It was about keeping a company out of jail. And then as we sort of got our legs and we learned to stand and learn to walk, and we matured a little bit, it seemed like the focus shifted and kind of is squarely now on this like efficiency play. And I think all of us, you said the word, all of us are trying to get to an effective program. And so what I'm asking is, do you feel the drive at that time was sort of, hey, we got to kind of bring all these disparate operations together under a singular umbrella so that we can have that sort of coherent strategy? Was it in order to just be more efficient? Or do you feel like it also sort of encapsulated, hey, the fact that there's all these duplicitous efforts is probably sending a mixed message to the workforce. It's probably like hurting our brand a bit. And like for us to actually not just be efficient, but actually be effective, we need to not like aggravate the workforce. Like, was that kind of forward? What I think that's forward thinking. Was that kind of part of the conversation when you guys were forming this organization, or was that something that sort of emerged down the road?
100%. It was part of the conversation. And you took the words out of my mouth as I was thinking about, how to address the question you were teeing up. Yes, there was an efficiency aspect to it, but that certainly was not the driver. The driver was really how to be more effective. The example I gave early on, if you want employees to follow the rules, you got to teach them what those rules are. We at Rockwell felt like we had a very, very strong culture and a tone at the top. But, how do you reinforce that? How do you really, make sure you've got an annual communication plan that is cohesive, that says, we haven't talked about this particular silo in a while. Let's hit this one or that one. But instead of having it run, 7 or 8 different ways by a variety of different subject matter experts, there was very much this desire early on in my tenure. And we started here by asking, why did I throw my hat in the ring and what did I bring to the equation? And I think that's why I was selected for the role initially, is because I had some thoughts around, having done this in sort of one silo for a while. I think I saw some opportunities to make it better, more effective. That's really what we were after.
That's so cool. Yeah, because you could appreciate it, and you probably had some added credibility as opposed to somebody coming in from the outside, being that you were kind of over one of those silos. You knew what the realities of the business were. You were outside counsel for a while. You know the business kind of inside and out. You've lived that reality. Walk me through a little bit. I do want to get into kind of how you brought all that together. But before that, you were kind of outside counsel, and then you came inside the company. That's always, that's like buying a car that like you rented on vacation, like you kind of know the car a little bit, but like when you bought the car, so to speak, was there anything that was kind of surprising? Like you thought things were one way at the company, and then you stepped in and you're like, oh, that was a little bit wrong about that. Or I was maybe a little naive about that. Or do you feel like you really had a great picture of the company, and there weren't a lot of surprises?
Well, that's a good question. And I don't want to portray my company in a bad light, but I guess if I had any surprise, it was sort of how bad things were. Maybe just a little bit of background. I mean, my company is Rockwell Automation, and we have our family tree has 2 very strong branches to it. One is out of the old Rockwell International, which was a big industrial conglomerate largely focused on aerospace and defense back in the, starting really from the 1940s and 50s on into the 70s and 80s. By the time I joined the company and was working for it in the early 90s, it was moving away from aerospace and defense. We actually sold all of that business to Boeing. And instead, we're focusing on technology. So we had a variety of different subsidiaries that focused on various different technological products and services, but all in the civilian sector. Where I was going with that, Nick, is that as a result of that corporate transformation of the company, we ended up accumulating a number of legacy liabilities in the environmental space that needed to be addressed. And that's primarily why I was hired. And so when I came on board, I was like, oh, yeah, it's even a little worse than I thought. We have a lot of old liabilities.
Just so was it briefly, you guys were buying kind of like these were stock deals that the liabilities came with?
And it was really more, it was less buying as divestiture. And so we were selling off and divesting a lot of businesses, but as a result of those deals, frequently we're forced to agree like, well, okay, we'll keep those legacy liabilities and the new buyer will go off and run the business. The other branch of our family tree, really briefly, is the old Allen Bradley Company, which started in Milwaukee back in early 1900s, 1904 or something. And that's where we're currently today, headquartered, and have been for a number of years. We're a Milwaukee-based company. And so both companies had a very strong legacy of ethics and integrity, sort of doing things the right way. And so it was interesting, around the time I joined, the two companies were relatively new together. We were transforming from aerospace and defense into a more civilian-based, technological, oriented company. And so it was a really interesting and exciting time to sort of be thinking through how do you build some of these programs from the ground up while building on a foundation of really, really strong, legacy commitment to doing things the right way.
That probably did a lot, having that strong sort of ethical foundation from both of these really big branches of the tree. Talk to me a little bit about how you were able to leverage those sort of like legacy ethoses, if that's the right word, right? You have these sort of you have these legacy companies that are built on this foundation of doing the right thing. That's probably a lot easier to build the structure that became your program upon that kind of a foundation.
Sure. So I talked a little bit about how I became the first compliance officer for the company as we started to build kind of a compliance organization. Separate and apart from that, I currently hold and have for the last 8 years an additional role at Rockwell as I'm our ombuds. We had a very, very strong legacy ombuds program, which, if that term isn't familiar to our listeners, it's essentially a way of describing a whistleblower hotline. Rockwell was one of the very first companies in America to ever have one. We started it back in 1984. And as a result, and I have been able to document that, and I kind of heard it through, company mythology, but, I went and did a little research, and there were newspaper articles at the time that, said Rockwell's appointing an ombudsman, put it in quotes because nobody really knew what that was. Yeah. So we were one of the first, but as a result, by the time I came into the role, it was well seeped into the DNA of the company. And I think I was able to build on that and drive it out even more effectively, so that today it's really a powerful tool that we have at Rockwell that helps bolster sort of our ability to make sure that we're always complying. We're essentially empowering all of our employees to be our eyes and ears, and encouraging them through very active communication and talking about this, that we want you to tell us if you see something wrong in the workplace. It's your first and best line of defense, to find out your own problems before they explode into bigger problems.
Yeah, I mean, you have all these human beings that have eyes and ears and brains, walking around the company. Those are much more sustainable sensors than some piece of, some actual sort of mechanical sensor or some electronic sensor that you place on things, right?
Right.
I agree. I mean, I agree 100%. It's like the mortar that can fill in the wall that is the culture of integrity that you're trying to build. Like, without that speak up piece, that wall can just topple over so easily,
That's
like
right.
the people participating in the risk management apparatus that you're trying to operate, that you've implemented, is like a prerequisite for us to do our job well, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you can put up
Mm-hmm.
a phenomenal program that's all forward thinking and blah, 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 but if people aren't participating, if they're not sharing that risk intelligence across the organization, you're going to be staring at a blank case management system, or you're going to be staring at a blank disclosure, campaign or whatever,
Yeah. No,
So how do you
that
do
is
that? How do
exactly
you,
right.
how do you, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, the other thing I agree with you 100% that it is that important tool. I feel like another very important and powerful function of it is what it broadcasts is that the company puts its money where its mouth is. We
Exactly.
don't. So I often say to employees is every company in the world is going to have posters on the wall, or they might have a code of conduct, or they might talk about, doing the right thing. But where I feel like we differentiate ourselves in some ways is we have these institutional mechanisms that really put some meat on that skeleton. And so when we created the Ombuds program, the idea was to encourage employees to report. It is sort of independent. So the charter that created the office says, I, as the Ombuds, report directly to the board of directors. The Ombuds cannot be fired, and my pay cannot be cut unless the board of directors says so. And when I explain that to employees, I say, look, what that means is if you observe our CEO doing something wrong, you can come to me, you can report it, and I have the freedom and the power to go investigate him, and he can't fire me. Now, the reality is that's never happened. It's never even come close to happening, but it's a powerful message to our employees that, like, hey, the company really kind of means it when they say,
Right.
we want you to report, because we've created this mechanism, and the report is not going to just, go to some office that, where it withers and dies.
Yeah. There's a sale that needs to take place. A sale, we have to persuade and that has to happen at the individual level. And of course you can
Mhm.
persuade via,
Mhm.
one-to-many communication, right? Like that's what marketing does all the time. They put out an ad and a bunch of people see, they put out a single ad, 1,000 people see that single ad. So it is possible to persuade, kind of in mass, but that persuasion has to actually happen for that behavior to be enacted, for that for that engine to engage. You know what I'm saying? And
Sure.
I love this model, and I just wonder why more people don't do this model, because this is like a genius model, right? You have an ombudsman. They can't be fired. They're, a quote unquote independent person, fully protected. To your point, that sends a very, very strong message. Like for you to be able to say, you can tell me anything because I have this hedge around me, and the company constructed this, they constructed it this way. I just think it sends a really strong message. And, I talk to a lot of people in this podcast, on our webinars, clients, and nobody feels like they're getting enough risk intelligence. Like if you think about it, the industry average is like 1.5 reports per 100 employees. Okay. So that's kind of the standard. It's been
Right.
that. I've been in this industry for almost a decade. It's always been that 1.5, 1.6. It's always that. But then you hear from like ECI that people are 6 to 8 times more likely to go to their manager to report some wrongdoing, to ask a question, than they are to go to the ombudsman or the whatever, the third party protected line, you know what I'm saying, that like is in place. So there's an 6 to 8, call it 7x difference between someone using the anonymous hotline versus going to their manager. But then if you look in those same reports, the benchmark reports, a tiny report, like there's less reports. I mean, it's like it's less than a third of that 1.5 are coming from managers. So my question is always like, well, then where are all these reports? Like people, there's absolutely things going wrong. And even if there's not things going wrong, there's absolutely people that think there might be things going wrong. So like those are all sort of potential reports. You also have one instance can have several different witnesses. So those are also multipliers to the reports. And then we're still talking about 1.5 reports per 100. So I talk to people and they're like, they feel like they're hitting the ceiling and they can't like get more of this risk intelligence. I see, I think human beings are like hope machines. We have to have some hope that like we can take that next step and we can make that next impact. And when that hope sort of dissipates, we sort of fall into this, I don't know, it feels like apathy. But to your point, I've seen firsthand little tweaks you can make in your communication or how something is structured that open the floodgates, because like everybody talks, you know what I'm saying? Like
Right.
if somebody,
Right.
like if somebody's going to call the hotline because they got harassed, I guarantee their friend at the company also knows about it way before they make that call. Because we're
That's
humans, we
right.
talk about stuff, we vent about stuff. So like if we can, so I'm just saying word spreads. And when somebody has a good experience, or when someone goes and talks to you and they hear, hey, did you know that we have a freaking ombudsman and they can't get fired? And like this company really does actually care about it. That also spreads. So like,
Yeah.
it's sometimes I get the sense, I'm bringing this home here, but I get the sense that sometimes people who are maybe not in a company like yours that doesn't have this long history of like foundational ethics and doing the right thing, and that they haven't had the first kind of speak up line in the world, it seems like they're like, man, I want to turn this thing. I have a vision for how I can turn this battleship, but I don't really know where to start because it's going to take sort of so long. I think that's kind of a misnomer, and I'd love for you to kind of comment on it. I get that it's a battleship and it can take time, but it doesn't mean that it can't turn. And I think it usually can turn with some intentionality a lot faster than people think. Has that been your experience? Like, what do you think about that soliloquy?
Well, I think your analogy of turning the battleship is apt, but it does turn.
Right.
And look, I mean, we weren't always like this. It had to start somewhere, and then it develops over time. And in fact, I'll freely admit this is public record. The reason why we started it was because we did have a huge ethical misstep.
Mm-hmm.
I'm old enough to actually remember this, but there was these variety of scandals in the mid 80s plaguing the defense industry, where they were overcharging the government because they had these cost plus contracts. So some clever people figured out, well, the only way to increase your profits on a cost plus contract is to increase your costs. And so that was the era of, you've probably heard the phrase, the $600 hammer and the $900 toilet seat. Rockwell got caught up in that back in the mid 80s, and we were caught. And the CEO and the chairman of the board at that time issued a letter of apology to our shareholders and said, we are going to take steps to ensure this never happens again. And that was the origin of the Ombuds program.
Wow.
As well as some other things. We wrote a code of conduct. Again, one of the first companies in America to actually write down a code and say, this is now going to be the rule book for employees. Let's be very clear on what our expectations are. And so where I'm going with all of that is, I'll repeat myself, I guess, but you have to start somewhere.
Right.
And so don't be overwhelmed by oh my gosh, this is going to be a slow turn in the battleship. Yes, it is. But then it does happen. And, the longest journey starts with the first step, and you take the step and you just keep preaching the message. And so I'm actually the beneficiary of this, because I stepped into this role 8 years ago and inherit the ombuds role. I've been the compliance guy for longer. Did wander and go do other things at Rockwell, by the way, that is interesting. But what I was saying is I was the beneficiary of this, because you do have that foundational aspect, and then you can just kind of continue to build on it. So I don't think we're done turning the battleship. You get new employees, you have turnover. We've done acquisitions. So how do you absorb the new company that you've just acquired and say, hey, we got this ombuds program and now you guys can participate as well? It's a constant reinforcement. And, not to overuse this, the analogy, but I feel like our battleship is still turning. We're still evolving.
Yeah, it's never done in a way. It's not akin to flipping a light switch. It's akin to building a bonfire that you have to keep going. And as it gets bigger, that bonfire has to get bigger. That takes more effort. That takes continuous effort to keep that going. So I want to ask, I want to go back. This is this is why I love this podcast. I get to talk to people that have these crazy stories, these super interesting things. And to be part of an organization that was one of the first codes, or that had one of the first codes and started this first sort of speak up line. It's just it's so mind-boggling to me. But as you were telling me about the code of conduct thing, what I started thinking about was like, isn't it interesting how like foundational elements today are really just innovations from before? And those, in that innovation, it didn't sound like there was this pretense about it. It didn't sound like there was this like greenwashing effect or this sort of like inauthenticity. It was like, hey, there's an issue. I'm owning it. Here's the letter to the shareholders. Hey, I own this issue, and we're going to take concrete steps that we think are going to be effective in curtailing this kind of behavior in the future. And so what is that? And somebody must have sat back, or a room of people sat back and said, well, we should have a list of like how people should behave, and we should have a way for people to speak up. Fast forward to today, you can't have a program without these two kind of foundational elements.
That's
you know
right.
what I'm saying? So
that's right.
But that, that acorn that first code of conduct grew into an oak tree that now is across every single organization, right? Everybody's like, oh yeah, right. That makes a lot of sense. And so I'm just saying that to kind of dovetail off of what you said. It's a constant process, and you just have to take whatever the most rational step forward is and just keep taking those steps. And then over time, you're going to continue to, change your elevation, and you're going to get higher and higher on that mountain that you're climbing. Right. We just can't let the size of the mountain that we're standing at the foot of, deter us from taking just whatever that next step is. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's exactly right. Yeah.
So you took this role. You're going to kind of start to bring all these folks together. What was that process like? Because I mean, I'm just trying to put myself in your shoes at that time. Tons of change going on in just the general economy. Your business is pivoting. You have these liabilities left over. There's a lot of stuff to sort through. You have all these different sort of compliance silos that are trying to be brought together. The business strategy itself has changed. I mean, there's so much change going on, it sounds like. And fast forward to today, of course, the ship is still, turning, but you guys have a world-class organization at this point, a world-class department. So walk me through a little bit, or some of those highlights of, like, what did you do to start to get traction, and what were some things you thought would work that ended up not, that were kind of surprising?
Yeah. Well, so what I found interesting I'm going to go back to the story of kind of, put us in the, late 1990s, early 2000s, when we were first trying to break down the silos and develop a program. One of the first things they did, podcasts didn't exist back then, but there were guys like you, Nick, or, people writing articles, or there were resources out there and available. So I kind of tried to tap into that and get some best practices ideas. So I don't want to take credit for like inventing all of this stuff. There was already at that time, starting to grow a body of work around compliance and sort of how you do this. And so I started to, ask a few fundamental questions, like, when we talk about compliance, I feel like it begs the question, comply with what? What are we complying with?
Right.
And so I wanted to get sort of the mission correctly defined. Because, and for right or wrong, the way I sort of defined it back then, and the way we built our program, was I answered the question, comply with what? To say I'm complying with governmental regulations wherever we do business that says this is what a company must do in order to follow the rules. We operate in 50 US states, 120 countries around the world. Each one of them have rules and regulations on from soup to nuts, starting a company, selling a product, hiring employees, building a factory, globalizing and moving your products across borders. There's a zillion rules out there. How are we going to follow those? Where I didn't want to go is there's also a lot of things that can add to mission creep. And I had lobbying efforts by other parts of Rockwell saying, hey, Gary, I handle industry standards. There's in our industry, NEMA or Underwriters Laboratory, or various different non-governmental agencies that talk about how our products should function. I want your help making sure we comply with that. I said, no. It's like, not my job. Sorry. I got to keep my eye on sort of this regulatory aspect. that's big enough as it is. And so I felt like if we define the mission appropriately, that would be step number one. Step two is I felt like it was important that it's not the job of the compliance team to, it sounds counterintuitive, but it's not the job of the compliance team to actually ensure compliance necessarily. It's the job of the compliance team to create the mechanisms to allow the business to comply with the rules.
Subtle, there's some nuance in that, but let's talk about that, because I think a lot of people get that wrong. Like this front end intentionality, the clarity with which you built it probably ended up paying dividends down the road, because you were able to keep focus and draw clear lines around what's in scope and what's out of scope.
Exactly. And then I think the subtle difference and the subtle nuance in what I was trying to describe, I often found it useful, as I've often done in my career, to put things very kind of bluntly and candidly. And that was, if we are caught not complying with something, do I lose my job? Or do you, the president of the business unit that did that, do you lose your job? Whose head's going to roll? Who's responsible? And in my view of the world, it was their head, not mine.
Right.
Now, I'm not trying to shirk responsibility. What I said to our business leaders was, I will create the mechanisms that are going to make it easier for you to do that. And there are some commonalities around that. I've mentioned one several times, training. You know, we have to have employees who know what the rules are. Let's teach them. Let's train on that. Another one is communication. It's like, we need to set the tone for the top. We need to set expectations. We need to encourage our employees to do the right thing.
Right.
You know, at that time, Enron was the poster child. You know, I've seen, you can buy it on eBay. You can buy Enron's code of conduct. Looks really good.
Right? Yeah. I want to get that and frame it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So they had all the right things, but you know, where they failed is they didn't create that tone at the top. They actually sent the different message to an employees that, you know, no, what we really want you to do is go lie, cheat, and steal, and not, you know, anyway.
Right.
So training, communication. I said, I feel like it's a part of the compliance team and function to do some auditing. Let's go, you know, trust but verify. Let's go see what we can do to, you know, ensure. And we'll do random sample spot checks. But so those are my job. That's what I will do to help you. But ultimately, you're running this business, and you need to be able to run it in a way that follows the rules.
Well, and so like, it's not like they're not subject to those rules, or it's not like they're only subject to those rules because there's a compliance officer. Those rules exist regardless of whether there's a compliance officer, kind of to your point. I just love how blunt that is, because so much of our job, I think, is like framing. We have to frame out the ombudsman program. We have to frame out whatever your approach is. And like when there's lack of clarity on quote unquote whose head is going to roll, I think that creates like undue, in many cases, it creates undue anxiety for the compliance officer, and it creates an opportunity for the ICs, the individual contributors, or those leaders to kind of shirk the responsibilities that, to your point, are kind of squarely on them. If you're running a shipping operation, well, it's on you to comply with those rules. It's on you to like know about them. So I really, I just think that is, you know, I mean, this is why I love this game, because I'm always learning something new. I'm always talking, you know, I talk to somebody like you. That's a phenomenal frame. Hey, whose head is going to roll if something goes wrong? You think it's me? It's not going to be me, because it's my job to put this stuff in place. It's my job to raise my hand when I feel like we're opening ourselves up to a risk and create those circumstances for success for you, the individual contributor. It's such a clear line in the sand of like what's in bounds and what's out of bounds. And it probably allows for a lot more clarity as the compliance officer who's building this operation to say no to things, or to clarify what you actually need from that other party whose participation is necessary for you to achieve your mission, you know?
Yeah. I would like to add too, that I found doing this and framing it in this way actually not that hard and fully embraced by my business leaders.
Well, it's clarity.
It is clarity, but I also feel like, you know, again, going back to the company culture, That was very much our culture, you know.
High responsibility kind of a culture.
Exactly, and want to do the right thing.
Right.
And so I wear two different hats at Rockwell. I'm our chief compliance officer, but also the ombuds. They're two very distinct roles with different, you know, some overlapping responsibilities, but very distinct. But in both roles, I feel like I've been so blessed by having business leaders who really get it and embrace it. So it's not been, you described it earlier as a mountain. Yes, it is, but I feel like it hasn't been that steep or hard of a mountain to climb because I've got, you know, good Sherpas and good, you know, people around me who are like, yeah, we're all going to climb this mountain together. This makes sense.
So I'm just so fascinated by like organizational psychology and like how that can be affected and how communications from leaders or communications from different departments can ultimately influence the perception that employees have of the business. I mean, because that's really where the behaviors start, I think. Do you feel like, so you've been there for several decades.
Right.
You've seen a lot. I mean, you've been through ups and downs in the economy. You've been through changes of like business model. You know, I'm sure that the company has grown tremendously from when you first got involved, maybe by orders of magnitude. Yet you've been able to preserve this thing, this like vibe, this ethos, whatever you want to call it, of like doing the right thing. How, like, I don't know how to ask this question. Like, obviously, there may have been over 100% turnover at the company over that time. And so there's kind of this corollary, right? Like the human body, they say over 7 years, every cell in your body has died and been replaced. Yet you're still the same person. So it's easier to maintain your personality during that like cell transformation or that cell like turnover, let's call it that. The cell turnover, I still feel like I'm the same person. I still look like I'm the same person, right? A little older perhaps. But in an organization, you don't see that same sort of continuity in many cases. You see a company sort of go through these different phases and maybe it sort of travels with the leader. It sounds like at your organization, despite massive turnover, despite massive growth, despite changes of like strategy, whatever, you have been blessed throughout the time, it sounds like, with leaders who get it. Those were your words. So do you feel like it's like a hiring thing that like you guys are just really good at finding people that like get it? Or do you feel like it's more like people are stepping into like a warm room and they can just take their jacket off and that allows them to be this type of person who gets it?
Yeah, I think your second analogy about stepping into a warm room is a more apt one, Nick, because so here's what I've sort of observed about a company culture. And this is it sort of dawned on me as how almost self-perpetuating it can be.
Yeah.
Because what we find when we ask our employees, you know, why did you join or why do you stay? One of the top responses we always get is because it's a very ethical culture. You know, people take pride in that. They like it. You know, I often say to sometimes, you know, do you want to be able to tell your mother that you worked at Enron or that you worked at a place like this? You want to be proud of the place you're working for.
Right.
And so it does start to just sort of perpetuate itself. This is the water we swim in. And so it attracts, you know, those species of fish that like that kind of water. The other thing that it's done is that, yes, despite turnover, the natural, you know, people leave for whatever reason, they retire, they find better opportunities, whatever it might be. We do tend to have at Rockwell extreme longevity of people who come and stay. You know, I've been there for 27 years, and I often joke that makes me a sophomore. You know, our CEO has been there almost 40 years. It was his job out of college, and he's still
it's unheard of anymore.
Now he's the CEO. It is, and it is very prevalent. It's not universal at Rockwell, obviously, but it's prevalent. And so what you get is then that almost tribal passing down of, you know, the stories and the mythology of, you know, this is who we are. And so you get that overlap of the long timers and the new people, and it's part of our recruiting strategy. And, you know, I don't know that we're all that good at just finding people. And believe me, we're by far not perfect. And the role of ombuds wouldn't exist necessarily. I mean, the whistleblower hotline is quite active. We get instances of wrongdoing, but then when you find it, you stomp it out quickly, and it just continues to sort of build that ethos. So
Yeah.
I don't know if I completely explained it well, but
No, you did.
I feel like it's that almost generational passing down of the culture, so that when currently today we've done some statistical analysis on this. More than 50, slightly more. It's like 51% of our employees have all been here for like 3 years or less.
Wow.
They're all new. A lot of newbies.
Wow.
So
So that's super interesting, right? Just that like more than half of your people have been there for less than 3 years, and yet, I mean, it's just proof of the perpetual motion machine that a culture can be. You know what I mean?
right,
I mean,
right.
As you were talking about that, I was just thinking like back to that bonfire thing. Like it's so much easier to keep a fire going than it is to start a fire. So it's like if it's going, you just got to kind of keep it going. You got to keep, and then it's a reaction. It's your culture. I believe our culture is like really just like the trailing 60 days or the trailing 90 days of like what everyone's been experiencing, because there's that recency effect, and that affects disproportionately how people feel. You know what I'm saying? And that amalgamation of all these thoughts and beliefs, and that is really what the culture ends up being. But I was at like an event, like an event in my town. It was by like the VFW, and I just, as you were talking, I was just thinking about, I don't know these guys, but they were both clearly Marines, and one guy was like in his 20s and the other guy was in his 60s, and like you wouldn't. These guys were generations apart, and they're hitting it off because they both went through the Marines, and they both kind of had that like Marines experience. And you know what I'm saying? So like, to your point, there's a reinforcing thing. Like people are attracted to be a Marine, and they get in there and they want to like exude those qualities that they see around them, or those stereotypes that kind of go along with that organization, and they end up just absorbing those values, and they end up living those values out, and they end up making Marine decisions at the point of conflict or whatever, and that's how it perpetuates.
That is exactly right, and I'm sure you've had plenty of guests who have probably said some variant of the same thing I'm about to say, and that is, culture trumps rules every day of the week.
Right.
Like you can write down all the rules you want, you can have all sorts of enforcement mechanisms, but it's really the culture that's going to drive compliance. And I've often said there is no greater motivation for an employee than to simply know this is what my boss wants. That's from the time we're a small kid in school and you want to try to please your teacher, or you join that first sports team and you want to try to please your coach, or as a little kid you're trying to please your parents. Right. You're just hardwired and motivated to always sort of do what the superiors around you are expecting of you.
Right.
And it's no different in the workplace. And so if your boss, if your manager, and all the way up to the CEO says repeatedly, here's what we really want you to do. Do the right thing. If it means making more money or walking away from a contract because it was obtained through a bribe, we want you to leave the money on the table and do the right thing. Right. If you have enough people saying that and repeating that message, that's how you create the culture. And that, going back to sort of what's the function of the compliance team, it's like, help the managers and the bosses do that. I write talking points. I write presentations. I'm like, hey guys, employees can hear it from me all day long, and it won't be nearly as powerful if they hear it from you. So
I agree.
Go out there, preach this message, and they do.
Yeah, they do. I say that all the time. Like, I'm always like, if you have a tone at the top issue, it's not likely that those people are just nefarious, twisting their mustache type of guys. You know what I'm saying? Right. It's probably like they're busy. They're probably just overwhelmed, and they're probably trying to put out their own fires. And there's this sort of like ethical overconfidence that I think corresponds to like as you get higher in an organization as well. Like you think, well, yeah, like, I'm not a bad guy. I don't hire bad people. there's probably not the wrongdoing going on. So I'm just saying all those dynamics are kind of headwinds for that actual voicing of the values to the organization. And it doesn't take much to put a presentation together or put some talking points together or fill out a communication plan for the year that says, this quarter, I really want to talk about speak up, or this quarter, I really want to talk about whatever, like you were saying earlier. But we have to create the circumstances for our own success. To your point, like if it's our job to enable the organization to do the right thing, and there's a disproportionate impact from a leader telling someone to do the right thing, well, then it sounds like that's the outcome I have to solve for. I have to figure out a way to get that leader to say the thing that I need them to say so that I can be impactful, so I can be effective. And I just love your kind of mentality. You know, it seems like you're always kind of focused on that outcome, and you're kind of working backwards from that to create the circumstances for success that make that achievement easier, you know?
Yeah. I'm wondering how you feel about this, Nick, but I've often thought the greatest movie or documentary that I've ever seen on compliance was it's called The Smartest Kids in the Room, and it's about the Enron scandal.
Yes.
What to me, when I watched that, what it really illustrated is it's kind of to your point. It's not like Enron went out and hired a bunch of bad people.
Totally.
They were actually good people trying to doing their job. But there was a tone at the top at that company that and what was interesting about the documentary is that, they found live examples of this, where senior leaders were saying, what this company is really all about is making money. We're not quite sure we care how you do it, but just do it. And so if you have to shut off the electricity to that, widow in Pasadena, do it. And boy, enough employees hear that message and it's like, well, it's okay. That's what the boss wants us to do.
Yes, sir.
Bad people. Right.
Right.
It just starts to create a culture of, well, that's what the boss wants us to do. And, it did them in the end.
I got to watch that again. I think I watched that before I've even gotten into this industry. I watched it back when I was many years ago. I'll have to watch that again. Yeah. It's just all these little decisions at the margin that sort of start to stack up and leave an impression on others that say, oh, okay, well, I guess that's okay. Of course, our words on the wall are all about integrity and respect and all of that. But at the end of the day, we just got to put the ball in the net,
That's right.
People solve for that. Man, this was really, really phenomenal. I feel like this could have been an hour longer. I have so many more questions we didn't even get to. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story.
Welcome.
This was really a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun for me too, Nick. And keep up what you do. It's good. It's good work.
Thanks. See you next time.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.